chairs fill up for the panel. I want to go ahead and start this panel because we've got a lot of stuff that's going to go on with this issue of immersion. That's kind of my introduction to immersion when I first got into playing Lara Croft games. And immersion, the whole idea of immersion is the metaphor of getting submerged into something. So today, this afternoon, we've got an interesting group of panelists from all different places. We've got Mark Becker, and these are in alphabetical order, so you have to wave your hand. So Mark Becker's a project user experience specialist from UserWorks. It's just up in Silver Spring on the Beltway. Sean Cashman, who's here all the way from Panel 5, from North Carolina. Pleased we could get him on this one too. Noreen Curran, who's from Ireland, Cork, Ireland, and she's a graduate student in the Human Factors Research Group there. Had the opportunity to really get to know her on a sabbatical over there, and said, "You got to come to MagFest. We'll make a way for it." Then we've got what's he next? Alphabetical order. Me, yeah. And I'm an associate professor in the psychology department at the University of Maryland. I got in trouble a few years ago when I introduced the psychology of video games. The problem is there's too big a wait list and people threaten me that they're not getting into the class. Next is a graduate student whom I've just gotten to know. My son, actually. Kirk Norman. He's up in the Human-Centered Design program at the University of Maryland Baltimore campus. So that's kind of our rival up there. I tried to get him to come to College Park. No, he said, Baltimore. Okay. And the last one, Sujan Shastra, is an assistant professor at Towson, and he's in the College of Fine Arts and Communications. And I'll stop there. Okay, no, and he's also a new graduate student in my lab, doing research on video games and immersion. Okay, so with that, we will start with Sean.
Can you hear me in the back there? Do I need to use this? No, you're good? Awesome. I like that. I like to move around a lot, so microphones, I trip over them and end up on the floor. It's not good. Anyways, I'm an associate professor in communication at Pfeiffer University in North Carolina. It's a small little college right above Charlotte. But I wrote my dissertation on immersion. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, particularly immersion in video games. And so what I'm going to do here is kind of get us rolling and starting off by talking about, well, what the heck are we going to talk about? Move this here. Okay, so to start us off, I have a quote here from Oliver Grouse, an art theorist, and he says that immersion is undoubtedly key to understanding the development of media. He's talking particularly of new media. Video games fall into that, but so does the internet and everything else. Even though the concept appears somewhat opaque and contradictory, that's because we haven't quite figured out what immersion quite means. We have an idea, we know what it feels like, you know when you're immersed, or at least you do afterwards, right? But we can't quite put a specific definition on it. And so, I use a space bar. So in my research, I found that what really the confusion and the reason we're having trouble is because we actually have multiple different definitions of immersion. And I kind of define them as physical. I'm going to go into more detail on what these are in a moment. So physically immerse into something, and there are certainly video games that build on this concept. The Kinect is one of those. Psychological immersion, I believe one of our panelists is going to talk about narrative here. And so how does immersion involve us in spacebar. I can do this. So games that have good stories can encourage psychological immersion, and then attention immersion, which is where our mind is in the experience. Right? So let me go into a little more detail on each one of these here at first. So physical immersion. Now, this definition of immersion comes to us from the virtual reality theorists. These are the guys who are trying to create virtual worlds we get lost in and we don't know where we are. And so they say that immersion is created by a sense of being. It's when we are physically involved, when our senses, particularly the sense of sight, they love the eyes, gets involved into a mediated text. We become immersed when we are physically involved. And so it comes to us from art, photography, virtual reality. Those are the people that use this definition the most. And they say that what we can do to immerse somebody is to activate their senses, their sight, their sound. And we can do this through media in a number of ways, but primarily by simulation and realism. So sticking people into cave environments. You know, those little huge giant boxes that look like the Virtual Boy, only bigger. If you remember the Virtual Boy. How many of you remember the Virtual Boy? Oh my goodness gracious. Excellent. Yeah, so that was one of the first real kind of, you know, Nintendo's attempts into that realm.
And the biggest flop.
Yeah, that too. All right. So games that involve immersion under this definition and under this concept of immersion are those that involve real-time interaction. And those that involve first-person perspective. So can you think of a game that does this?
Halo?
Halo. Yes.
Mirror's Edge.
Yeah. Practically every first-person shooter. So under this definition of immersion, first-person shooters are the ideal games. Because they're the ones that are going to involve you the most, to immerse you the most. And that's fine and dandy. These games can be very immersive. But then how do we get immersed in games that don't involve this, like Tetris or Angry Birds? Because we can't rely totally on this understanding of immersion. There are other different definitions, other ways we can think about immersion. The second definition of immersion I see a lot is psychological immersion. And this defines immersion as an emotional experience. So the first one, physical sensation. Now we're emotionally involved. And this comes to us from literature, film, and television primarily. Those particular media scholars that focus on media that has narrative emphasis. So those that have stories involved in them. And so the idea is that you're going to get immersed if it's got a really good story. And yes, we can get immersed in a good book. And so in games, when they take this definition and scholars apply it to games, they say, well, the best way to immerse people is by giving them avatars that they can create and identify with and be themselves and role play in those environments. And they define the act of immersion in these environments as kind of like a visitation. You're kind of getting into it as a theme park. And for them, one of the primary ways for immersion to occur is through social interaction. So you might hear some people say, well, you can't get immersed in a game unless you're playing with other people. Can you think of a game that uses...
World of Warcraft.
Oh my gosh, yes. But there are a number of others that can too involve this. I think Assassin's Creed has a very good story as well. And you do interact with other characters within it. But it's not, I know it's not PvP or anything. Although is Assassin's Creed PvP? Can you play that way? There is a PvP element?
Yeah, really.
Oh. I'm just now getting into it, so I'll have to try that out. Alright, so the third definition of immersion that I see a lot is attention immersion. This defines immersion not as an emotional state, not as a sense of being, but as a cognitive act. So it's wherever your mind is. Separation of mind and body. This comes to us primarily from the cognitive sciences group, and they're not really interested in games, so they don't have written a whole lot on this in terms of games. But what they have said is that if we really want to immerse people into a game is that we give them good puzzles that make them think. We give them a lot of agency, the ability to act in an environment, a lot of choice. And we give them really good rewards and punishments, so achievements come to us from these people. So, you know, I mean, how many of you played a game just to unlock all the bloody achievements? I'm seeing some, you'll admit it, you're admitting it. Okay, so yeah, it's certainly popular, and they like simple games. So there are games out there that really fit this definition of immersion. Yeah, that one. Most definitely. I had seen people get into fistfights over this game. You know? Even in your lab they do. Okay. Alright, so now when it comes to gamers and game industry and game designers, I did a study to look at, all right, well, what definition are these people using? I looked at their online forums and I did a textual analysis, and what I found is that they use all three. And they use them interchangeably. And it makes me wonder, well, do we need to kind of combine all these definitions of immersion into one definition? Or do we just want to create some sort of Frankenstein definition of immersion? But really, if we do that, then I think we're just going to make people even more confused. And this has become such a problem that some scholars, like Gordon Collegiate, who's head of the University of Copenhagen's Game Studies program, has said, we need to get rid of immersion as a term when talking about games. We need to use incorporation instead. I don't agree with Gordon. I like him a lot. I've read his book. It's wonderful. But we can still use the term immersion because a lot of other media can immerse us as well, and they do so in different ways. What we must recognize, though, is what distinguishes video games from these other media is that we come to them expecting a different experience. So when we go to a movie, we expect a good story, or Brad Pitt, right? We expect to see a good narrative. When we read a book, we expect a good narrative. We don't get it. I don't care if there are puzzles in the book. If murder mystery is really confusing, I don't care if it's bad. Right? So we got to really think about what we want when we come to games. So we can't rely on any one of these definitions specifically when it comes to video games because there are many different types of video games out there, and some of them elicit different experiences. So Tetris, we don't go to it for a story. We hope. Right? So we have to think about, all right, well, we have to think that when we come to games, we must recognize that we come to them with very different expectations than we do with other media. And although we can rely on these other scholars and their definitions of immersion, their ideas of what immerses us, we must recognize that video games are a distinct medium that draw on these other things. I mean, cutscenes draw from film, and certainly Skyrim draws from, I don't know, War and Peace. It's different, right? So, with that in mind, there are some things that these three definitions share in common, and that's an idea of the characteristics of immersion. So if we think about immersion from the notion of where it came from, as a metaphor, as Kent said, the idea of immersion comes from a metaphor, jumping into water and the experience of being underwater. And if we think of video games as a big jug of water, so we have Robot Unicorn Attack, and we're about to dive into it, there is depth to that water. We can become deeply immersed into it or only partially immersed into it. So we can go pretty deep into it. The farther and farther into the game or media text we go, the less we are aware of everything around us. We cannot reach the bottom or we go crazy. Because that's when you can't distinguish reality from fantasy. That's the worry of everybody who made Mazes and Monsters if you watched that movie yesterday. So it's got depth. It has width. There are many ways to get us immersed into the game. Robot Unicorn Attack has some fun music. You know? So it could be the music, it could be the gameplay, it could be the goal. We come to it with different expectations of what we want. And although this is a very simple game, there are games that have a lot of different ways that people can enter into it and engage it. So it has width. When we are involved, well, okay, this is interesting. Okay, when we get immersed into something, it creates a spatial distortion. We become less aware of the things going on around us. We know that, right? So we are not aware when our roommate comes in and starts messing with our stuff or whatever. We become less aware of other things happening in the room next to us. We also lose track of time. Right? It creates a temporal. I was only playing for half an hour. It's 3 in the morning! Right? I mean, all of us have done this. You know, we've all done. We started playing. I'm gonna go play 10 minutes. 2 hours later.